Hi, everybody. This is Mark Ryan, and welcome back for the second in a series of conversations that I've been having with Troy Mclachlan. It started off as a 1 hour conversation, which turned into almost 8 hours, edited down to 6.5 hours for those of you that have already listened to that. And there were so many questions from listeners and questions from myself over a period of time that Troy and I agreed that we would continue and do it. We had kind of had a marathon session, so we were both pretty tired. And that session happened a few weeks ago. And what turned out to be a catch-up with 1 hour, again, turned into about 6.5 hours of recording. That it'll probably be edited down to between 5 and 6 hours as you're listening here. Now, last time we got into a little bit more about the planetary alignment and planetary history, and we got into a little bit about money. And the money part really interested me from many different perspectives, because I do a lot of work with attracting wealth, what to think about wealth, how to have the mindset. And Troy had a really unique view on money and wealth. One of the biggest things that he talked about was going back to the temple back in Jesus' time with the temple tax and Rome, and how all that went together, and how the financial system collapsed around that same period of time. Just so much information that what I decided to do is to take that, really go into depth with it. And he had called me, emailed me, and said, I've got some great new information if you want to go deeper into that. So that was the setup for the second call. And I got to tell you what, again, 1 hour turned into 6.5 hours, and I still have more questions. I've gone through and listened to it again, going through the editing part of it, and it's fascinating. Some of the best conversation I've ever had, and just listening to it again. So many things when you're doing an interview with somebody, you can hear it one way, but when you're not having to talk, you can hear it another way. And I really didn't realize the tremendous amount of incredible, fascinating information that we got. And that's why I call this Fascinating Money. So I'm hoping that you find it as fascinating as Troy and I did, and you'll give us some questions or some kind of comments on YouTube, or write back to us at our websites and let us know what you'd like to hear about next time, some other questions that you may have. But I promise, if you listen to this and really consider what we're saying about the history of money and an explanation of its dynamics and how to look at it differently, where Troy compares it to what we're going through now to the actual biblical ideas, spiritual ideas about money. And again, it's just fascinating. You can kind of get an idea where you're at and your belief systems are, and what maybe you can change in your thoughts or thinking, or just not. Just enjoy this as a conversation between two people, and leave it at that. Other people out there might find it interesting to begin to play with some of your belief systems, or even shift and change how you deal with money based on this conversation. I don't know. There's some sensitive areas that we get into with money. Again, Troy doesn't make big leaps with the sensitive stuff. He goes back and goes in and talks about it from a perspective of history, recorded history. And there's some speculation that we get into. Of course, I like that aspect of it, where we get into possibilities, where we come to a real refinement of the history of it around the time of the Roman Empire and around the time of Jesus, and before then with Babylon. His history brings in details that I've never heard before, fills gaps. And from that, you can start to make some kind of speculation and jump. It may not be true, but if it is true, I got to tell you what, it's fascinating. Again, there's so much in this that you've got to get something out of it for yourself, something out of it. And I hope you have as much fun listening to it as I have the second time and interviewing Troy the first time. He's an amazing man, incredible historian, and he backs up and can back up what he's saying. So give us some feedback. Let us know how you think. But get ready for Fascinating Money with Troy Mclachlan and myself, Mark Ryan. Enjoy it. Let us know. Take care. Here's Troy. Oh, one more thing. As we started to get into the conversation about how we were going to record this, Troy and I started going down the road. So I said to him, why don't we go ahead and start recording now? But before that, there was some juicy information. So I picked up during our conversation, and it's pretty easy to get into. It's not going to be like you're going to be disjointed or come in with a non sequitur and try to remember where you're at. Just start paying attention from our conversation, and then I do a formal introduction and take it from there. I think you're going to enjoy the whole setup Here it is. Here's Troy into our conversation.
No, no, that's fine. Cosmology is important in the sense that I've noticed most people seem to gravitate towards it, no pun intended. They're fascinated with this new history of the solar system, and it and for many people working out the details, and it's where whatever criticisms I've had have been leveled from that direction. It's almost like it overshadows the whole reason I put Saturn Death Cult together was to simply give the basis for the archetypes that are used, give the history of where the archetypes that affect our common psyche come from, that are then used by those who would institute debt-based money systems.
Well, look,
And
before you talk
you know,
too much, we're getting to the point where I want to start asking you questions. Let me at least
all right,
introduce you, and then
and we'll just
then
go.
we'll go
Yeah,
go forward. Hey, everybody, this is Mark Ryan, and I'm up here in lovely Mount Shasta, California, and I'm bringing back for another interview because we've had some requests for it, and also we've got some updated information from my friend and author, Troy Mclachlan. Is it McLaughlin? Am I
it's
saying that right?
McLaughlin, correct? Yes.
McLaughlin. And he's now, last time we talked, he was in New Zealand, and now he's in the UK, and we're glad to welcome back Troy. Troy, welcome back to the show.
Mark, it's an absolute pleasure to be back here chatting with you, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all the people who have contacted me since our last discussion, and as a result of that discussion, there's been a number of people been very positive, and really some good relationships built up from there. And I'd also like to take the opportunity, Mark, to thank you because the last interview I did a lot of talking, but at the end of the day, you put the effort in and made it all happen and put a lot of work in there. So thanks very much for that.
Well, thank you, Troy. I mean, it was an incredibly interesting subject, still is, and really enjoyed the conversation. Didn't know how long it was going to go. We ended up talking, I think, almost 8 hours. We edited it
Yeah.
down to about 6.5 hours, and maybe a little bit less than that. But I didn't know what the response was going to be, whether from people that I knew or people on my list. And really, at that point, I didn't care because it was interesting to me, and I like to get into topics that really stretch the mind and make the mind think away from the current system. So I appreciate you coming on. I'd listened to you on a call with Henrik on Red Ice Radio, and
Hmm.
was fascinated. And I was glad that you were able to come on and kind of follow up because I had so many questions after listening to that show, and after we talked, I had a whole bunch of questions, and I'm glad we're getting this follow-up call now. You've been through some changes. You've moved. You've gone from New Zealand. You're into England, and
Hmm.
you've got some feedback based on our show and Henrik's show with Red Ice, and you're
Correct.
getting ready to go on there again. And luckily, I got a chance to talk to you a little bit before you go on there, and we can flesh out some of the new information that you have, and maybe help some of the people with the questions we did have get a tighter understanding of what's going on. So, with that, welcome to the show, and glad to have you here. And why don't you tell me a little bit about your move? You've been kind of doing some changing halfway around the world, and from
That's
one end.
correct. Yeah,
To,
quite literally from one end of the globe to the other. I'm British by citizenship, but I was brought up in New Zealand. But circumstances just mean our family now can all get together in one place in the UK. So we've made that move, and must say it's been very pleasant. There are vast differences from where I was from in New Zealand, which was very rural, isolated, up in the mountains, very much. Lord of the Rings country where they did a lot of filming. Just before I left, they were wrapping up filming on The Hobbit, just up the
ah,
road. So it gives you an idea of the kind of country that I was coming out of. And now I'm based in a place called Stratford-on-Avon, which is most famous as the birthplace of William Shakespeare. So I certainly have no excuse to not get into the muse of writing where I am at the moment. And I got to say, it's a very different change of pace, but the access to information and uh, research resources here in the UK really compensates for what I've left behind in New Zealand.
oh, fantastic. So, writing, last time we talked, you were going to do some, maybe possibly some fiction writing or novel
Right.
writing as compared to where you've been with the Saturn Death Cult writing. And by the way, for those that, if you want to go check out his website as we're talking, it's saturndeathcult.com. SaturnDeathCult.com.
Yes, well, Saturn Death Cult as the website that I put together was always really just a an exercise in pulling together a what a lot of writers call a universe for creating a backdrop to either fiction or further studies. And I had long been interested, way back, going back into the 1980s. I had discovered the writings of Immanuel Velikovsky with his very controversial cosmology that talked about erratic orbits and such of the various planets in our solar system. And so I'd known about this strange take on the solar system's history, as opposed to the uniformitarian idea that it's been a slow process of accreting together from a circumstellar disk. And at the time I discovered this, I was involved in studying for a degree in Egyptology at Auckland University. And of course, I ran into my first experience of how controversial just mentioning the name Velikovsky can be
Yeah.
in these sorts of circles. And all that did was just simply put me on a path of, well, it's, methinks they protest too much.
That were
Uh,
I remember you told a story or something about you had mentioned it to one of your professors or
mm,
teachers, and you got a pretty terse response.
Surprisingly so. I wasn't prepared for it at all. I had no idea about the controversy surrounding Velikovsky, and I'd seen that I was wrong in saying it was a dedication. It wasn't a dedication. It was just it had been sent to this professor by Velikovsky himself
Ah,
with a handwritten note in it. So, being young and so on, I just simply assumed, not knowing how the academic world works, I just assumed that there was a personal relationship there of some kind. So I thought I was on, firm ground to approach this person. And honestly, it was like it baffled me why it was such a problem. But all it did was it just served to push me in that direction. And so I've been looking at these historical reconstructions, both on a cosmological basis and even a historical basis. And in the process of doing so, I've managed to sort of work out for myself a very broad generalization of what might have happened, and eventually the whole thing moved into sync when I came across Saturn theory, which is the basis of the cosmology in Saturn Death Cult, and that postulates the idea that Earth originally was a satellite of the planet Saturn when that planet was a sub-brown dwarf star. That sub-brown dwarf star and its satellites, Earth and Mars, drifted into contact with the current sun that we have during historical times, and subsequently the events that took place as a result of that and were witnessed by mankind on Earth between Saturn, between the Sun, between Saturn and Jupiter, and all the various other planets. This became the basis of myth and mythology, and also subsequently spawned many of the archetypes that have affected our literally our way of thinking as a species.
you
And
know,
go ahead, Mark.
yeah, this is something I want to bring up with the listener as well. Is one of the reasons I like to go into what some people say is, you're going into conspiracy theory, you're going into, speculation and different things like that. And I like to do that myself personally because I have been studying and working with people's belief systems for years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because they get into belief systems and they're locked into belief systems, but they weren't in there. They had to be convinced to get in there in the first place. But it's like once they've made that determination, a lot of times it shuts off new data from coming in.
Yeah.
And as an exercise for myself, and I would say for the listener, that for many, many years, we believed that the sun went around the earth. And now we look at it and say cosmology says, no, we go around the sun. And it changes not only the way we think, but also the other systems sometimes that we're locked into. When I've played with some of these conspiracy theories or speculation or new science, quantum physics. Some of the stuff in quantum physics, people would say would be science fiction, but it's not. They're discovering more and more of what it represents. And if you go in there, when you break free of that belief system, a lot of times you break free of other belief systems, and then you start to realize what you may be missing. So I invite the listener to play with us, to go along with this, not just to see how accurate it is, and I would recommend that you check up on the history and the data that Troy's saying, but also to explore your own belief systems, to see what keeps you there, what kind of things are stoppages. You say, well, I don't believe that. That can't be true. Well, what if it was true? What if it is true? What does that do to how you view and see the world? And a lot of times, just by changing that perspective, your life will completely change, and you'll realize what a gift this wonderful world we live in, because you're able to accept new things that come in there and see new things that you couldn't because of your past beliefs. So what we're presenting here, what Troy's going to present, keep open-minded on this. Let this come in. Play with the idea like you're watching a movie or reading a book, and you just want to get away and go out and explore and see what happens at the end. See what happens by just sitting with us and exploring these ideas. I'm sorry, Troy, go ahead and
Well, I think what you're saying is, vitally important to anybody listening to any discussion that other people are having on how they view data from history or science and so on. And where we get a nice crossover in my own researches and your own area of expertise, Mark, really sort of comes in the study of archetypes, these psychological root concepts that affect virtually every human on this planet that seem to have been passed down through the generations. And it really, I think you would possibly agree with me that coming to understand the origins of these archetypes can often set you free from those control systems that have used these archetypes to basically facilitate their own agendas. Once you know the origins, once you have a clear idea of where these these basic archetypes come from, you're far more liberated to think critically about data that's coming into you.
yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. There's something that happens if you break free from that and look at it from a dissociated perspective from the outside, um, looking in. Whereas right now you might be viewing things from your belief system, and that's your identity. But when you start to go outside and can look at it from another perspective, from the
Mm.
outside looking in, a lot of times you see exactly what you're saying. What are the archetypes that have been controlling you, and how you've been uh, under their power, so to speak,
Yeah.
and not at free choice or free will to make a determination based on other data. We've just accepted this, especially in the first 7 years of life. We accept this information without thinking because we don't have a critical factor in there. And the thing is not to just accept something blindly. Well, when you're exploring new ideas, we're kind of asking you to do that. Accept it blindly for a little bit and see what happens, but also then bring in your critical factor. What do you want to keep? What do you want to throw away? What do you want to explore? What do you want to let go? Yeah.
Yes, and when you look at the evolution of Saturn theory, this strange cosmology that places Saturn as Earth's original sun before um, Saturn and Earth were captured by the sun, and then the rearrangement of the planets that you know the witness accounts are called mythology that recount this rearrangement. When you look at the evolution of this theory, you see that the fundamental connection was between two very divergent areas of expertise, one mythology and the other straightforward physics cosmology. And the incredible uh, result was that people who were comparative mythologists made the jump in actually believing that you can only understand these mythological records as an actual record of physical events witnessed by humans at the time Otherwise, if you just try to see it as a construct of the human imagination, it's a veritable madhouse. You'll never get a consistent story out of it. Yet there's that underlying suspicion that mythology does hold some kind of consistent story, whatever it would be. So the crossover between the two was the breakthrough. Uh, and of course, we all owe Immanuel Velikovsky a tremendous debt of gratitude for making this connection. Myself, because as you alluded to earlier, the fascination with subsequent human actions in terms of conspiracy, and that idea that you're dubbed a conspiracy theorist if you believe conspiracies exist. Yet when you read history, everything seems to be a conspiracy. The American Revolution was a conspiracy. The English Civil War was a conspiracy. The Roman Empire was a conspiracy of individuals. So conspiracy is part of the human equation. But when you take the non-acceptable conspiracies that circulate out there, and you start to identify the archetypes that are prevalent within those conspiracies, when you reduce those conspiracies down to the archetypal levels, what's been amazing to me is how well that then fits in to the process of taking mythology and applying it to real cosmological events by throwing out the uniformitarian idea that everything just forms extremely slowly over a period of time, and the sky, you know, the key to the past is that everything was the same in the past as it is today. So really, I'm just simply taking it personally one step further and looking for the same archetypes that are in mythology that brought about this new cosmology, and looking to see how they manifest themselves in the in conspiracy theories as they exist today. And the one prime archetype that seems to come through strongly is the control mechanism that comes out of a thing that I call the debt-based money system, or debt-based money systems, as they've manifested through history. And I think that's the basis to all serious contenders for conspiracy, you know, that we look at as individuals.
It really does seem to narrow down to that area, and you start to talk about the Roman, what they say is the mythology and the archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where it got into my head. It's still there in a like some residue of it, but for some reason, growing up as a kid, I used to think of the mythology and those old stories like I did with cartoons on television, that they
Mm.
they weren't real, they were fake, they were phony. And again, I got locked into that belief system, and then I missed a lot of data. Now, with your information, and before that, some of the stuff with Joseph Campbell, I start to open up and go, oh no, these people weren't just telling stories like we tell cartoon stories on
Mm.
television. Disney does. These people were documenting in a way that the mind understands, by stories, events that happened throughout
Yes.
history. And you see the correlation as you go in and study it, and you see the correlation, and I start to go, oh my gosh, what have I what have I missed for so many years of my life? And now, what I guess why this is so interesting to me is going into a track and catching up, and so to speak, to say what have I missed and what's available to me now in this. And what got me involved in it was exactly what you said, was the debt money system, because I'm like, something is amiss here, something's going on, something's not right. Who's controlling this? And
Right.
the stories that I would read, and conspiracy theories, say, okay, maybe some of this is true, maybe some of this is not. But one of the things that is true is, in my logical way of thinking about things, from helping individuals, people helping people, working in a cooperative world, but still having capitalism where we can make money. If we want to work harder, make more money, fine. If you don't, you don't have to. But the combination of that something is working against that and has a different agenda.
Mm.
Because it's just not making sense, and people, I hear people saying it all the time. This is crazy. It doesn't make sense. But if you go into your theory of like the Saturn death cult and some of the monetary theories about debt and what it represents, it all makes sense.
Yeah, well, this is the key to understanding where I've connected the modern debt-based money system to these archetypes that come directly out of mythology. And I think this is what the listeners need to understand. What I'm saying is that what drives our belief in our money systems today, whether we accept it or even if those of us that question it, what drives that belief are actually archetypes that are all first formulated and recorded in mythology. Now, that's a pretty grandiose statement to make. But what I'm saying is that when you understand mythology and the origins of the archetypes that make up the stories of mythology, and like many people, like yourself and even myself, we thought of mythology as just a synonym for fiction, imagination, that sort of thing. But if you start looking at mythology as an extremely uh, cleverly correlated collection of archetypes, basic human reactions from the subconscious. If you look at mythology as that, then mythology really gives you the keys to understanding just simply why we live in a crazy world where we accept something that most of us at a basic level understand is crazy, is out of control. And this was the connection that I was most hoping to make in people's minds in a very generalized way, but basically to bring that to the fore.
That's great. So let's get right into it because this is money is I recently went to a seminar and
Mhm.
it was about money and one of the things that the guy listening to him before I went to the seminar gave me some really good shifts, but basically it brought me back to something that I'd forgotten when I was younger. I had a born again experience, and then through that experience, I understood that there was something else in the universe to connect to besides my brain. There was some kind of information coming in that was completely shifting my world in a really radical and miraculous way, and I had no control over it. But because I accepted something and opened up to something and said, "Yeah, let's give this a try. I'm open to this. Yeah, let's come in. Change my reality, change my life, save me." And everything went dramatically different from that moment on. And yet I found myself kind of forgetting about that. And this going to the seminar, it was more of a seminar about money and money dynamics. And his deal was bring it back to the money because everybody understands money. And he goes, I defy you to find a situation where you have a problem that doesn't somehow resolve around your belief systems about money. You can associate it to your relationships. You can associate it to your relationship with God, to your family. He goes, if there's an issue with money, it somehow relates to every other aspect of your life. And it really shifted me and reminded me, oh, wait a minute, there is a different source, but there's a part of me that gets stuck and caught up in the archetypes of the brain and the body as opposed to archetypes that are outside of my body. Does that make any kind of sense to you?
Yes, it does. And something that sort of occurred to me as you're saying is that if you wanted to define the conspiracy that I relate to in Saturn Death Cult and so on, is the greatest conspiracy is the attempt to make money virtually a religion in its own right, in that we give money the authority and our trust to solve our problems, to actually deal with our problems and provide solutions to all aspects of our life. This is the conspiracy that that I most like to sort of concentrate on, is this idea that we've moved into this thinking that puts trust in money, and really to put it probably most succinctly from a biblical point of view, if you go to First Timothy 6:10, this of course is the very famous statement that first got me thinking very much about money, and that is that the love of money is the root of all evil. Now, that surprised me because I would have thought that the devil's rebellion was the root of all evil, or the devil himself was the root of all evil, or the following of the devil. All this idea of God versus the devil seem to be the base of all. Yet here is a very clear statement that it is the love of money, not money itself, but the love of it, that constitutes the root of all evil. And to me, that love competes with the love of something this thing that you were talking about, Mark, about something outside of yourself.
Yeah,
Uh,
can I just say in
sure.
the love aspect, I did some research on what the root of that word is, and you're probably better at this than me, but what I gathered and what I got from it was that the meaning of that type of love, because there's different type, like 5 to 7 different types of love
Sure.
in the Bible, was a worship, a a worship of money. The love
Yes.
worship of money is the root of all evil.
Yes, and to worship in the biblical sense, that actually the Greek word used there derives further. It's agape, I think. It derives further from the Hebrew word lev, which is the word that is used to when stated to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind. And the word lev, in terms of that type of love, means to come to understand, to come to be in synthesis with. And this goes back to a discussion that you and I had in our last talk, which is that many people get confused with the capacity of the human created in Genesis as related to us in the Bible as being in the image of God, being physical. But in
Hmm.
fact, what we were really talking about was that to be made in the image of God means to have the capacity to think like God. And
Yes.
so to come to a love of God is to reach that point where you have the capacity to think like God, but you want to think as God or as God would in a situation. And this is the true meaning of what it means, what the first commandment is, to love the Lord your God with all your heart. So that when you have this transferred to the love of money, then what you're doing is the third commandment. Was it the second commandment? Said, um, "You shall have no idols before me." All right. What you're doing is you're transferring an understanding and a worship of God and how He thinks and how that thinking affects your reaction to events that you come up against. You're transferring that to your whatever it is that you consider money to be. And this is a crucial understanding for many Christians, and really it's far more important, in my opinion, than many of the maniacus sort of ideas that out there is a battle between an entity called the devil and an entity called God. It seems to me that God is far more concerned about how we love money and how we love him than he
Yeah.
is about this sort of battle over who's going to get eternal torment or eternal life.
Yeah, and that's basically what happened to me during this. It was before the seminar, but during the seminar, it was a reminder that for years I had lived not from money. It was from the abundance of this other source coming into my life, and what he kept saying is, he says, you're going and you're looking to say, like he'd say to people, well, did you want to go on a trip? Did you go on the trip? No. Why? I don't have the money.
Mm.
And he goes, well, if your source of abundance is God and it's not the money, then if you've got a desire for it or something's in there and it's actual, it's coming from God, you're making a decision on the money you have, not on the fact that
Yes.
to go forward and make a decision. He goes, you won't get the money till you make a decision, and that's the faith aspect. And it's like such a simple switch, but to say, wait, my source of abundance is God. It's not the money. And what we do when we answer the question is, did you do this? Well, I mean, there's a point of being practical too. You just don't get out of control with it.
Sure.
But the idea is, what are you loving more? What are you trusting more? Are you trusting something in you that says, no, you're supposed to go? It's set up for you to go. It's ready for you to go. Make the decision to go, and the how-to will be taken care of by by God. And he's saying, you're saying, no, I see money tells me I only have this much in the bank, and that this is the only possible way to get there. And he says, now you reversed the money dynamics. You've reversed the source dynamics of who you are and where your source is from.
Yes, this is often the theological and just straightforwardly the logical downfall of what has often become known as the prosperity gospel, in which case you're in trouble, so you call on God to help you by giving you money.
Yes.
The basic idea of that is, in fact, that you are placing your trust in money.
Yes.
So God's got to go out and do the work to find the money to get to you to do whatever it is you want to do. There is a fundamental disconnect there, and really it just comes down to the economics of what is given in the Bible, and the economics of mankind in its various forms. And the way I just simply see this, Mark, is that at the end of the day, uh, God, if by right of creation, uh, God is sovereign, all that is on the earth to produce from, i.e., to mine or to farm or anything along those lines, belongs to God. When that is taken into account, all right, then the economic system that uh, exploits that all that is created by God becomes the means by which we share in the bounty of God.
Well,
All right.
okay. So let me. This is a point of distinction, and you're right at it. So I'd like to ask you this question: the other another flip that I had, what I'd been locked into, and I could realize that the dominion of money kind of it was over me. I was kind of under it. I was
Mm-hmm.
understanding money. You know what I mean? Like
Sure.
standing under it, and because the world is so controlled, basically, and we go back to the debt and the money system.
Mm-hmm.
But then it came to me just as clear as a bell. Wait a minute, that's also part of the realm of what's God's, and if He decides what He wants to do with that money, that's His choice.
Yeah.
That's so. If the money wants to, and I'm just saying this as an idea of money being a converted form of substance or sustenance from God. That we
Mm-hmm.
happen to use this system, but it's almost as if these bankers or the Saturn death cult has taken it and saying, no, it's ours, and anything underneath it is ours. But it's the jump frog of going like, no, wait a minute, it's still
Yeah.
whatever you created, whatever you did, however you label it, is still God's, and He can determine what He does with whatever is in uh,
Well, basically in his creation.
creation. Yes.
Yeah. And this is the fundamental disconnect that people who, for instance, do not have a religion will make, and that is the idea that somehow they have a right to an ownership right to the land under our feet, the resources that we rely upon to sustain us in terms of our physical existence, and basically people with a Celtic background, Amerindian, American Indian background, quite a few of the Asian cultures and so on. They understand the relationship between humans and Earth as one of custodial rights and not ownership rights, whatever their god might be. And this is a fundamental part of the biblical concept of what God is and what His claim to sovereignty is. And so, subsequently, from a biblical perspective, we have this battle between the conspiracy of God to provide us with a monetary system under His sovereignty and the conspiracy of men who would be gods to take control or ownership or sovereignty of the resources that we see through a money system that is beneficial to them and them only.
It's amazing how all this stuff goes together, especially so recently it's been happening. I'm watching a show called Dowington Abbey or something
Oh
that's
yeah, Downton Abbey, yes,
yeah.
big.
And I had again the shift. Once I had one shift, then another shift comes and another shift, and it starts to put everything back in line again.
Mhm.
And the big shift was that here's this guy, the Lord and the Master of the estate, and his two heirs that put him in the estate die on the Titanic, and now here comes somebody else that he doesn't even know that's going to come in to take over, that's now in charge, that's taken his, because he doesn't have a direct line, and everybody's trying to figure out on the side about the money and how they can manipulate it. And this guy's just what you said. He's a steward. He says, no, I'm a steward of this. I was put in charge, and if it's
Yes.
not my time, then I go somewhere else and I'm in charge of something else, and this is what it's supposed to be. And they're all fighting for the money, and another penny drop, so to speak. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that's all I am. Like you said about the some of the American Indians and the Celtics or Celtics. What's the proper way to say that? Celtic or Celtic?
Celtic's a football team,
Okay,
or a
Celtic.
basketball team where you're from.
That
Yeah.
they're but really, then I got thinking, like all the stuff that I have now, and I kind of imagine myself in a perspective of being gone and looking back and going, well, I don't have any of that stuff to be a custodian over anymore. Who's going to take care of it? And who all the stuff I hid wait a minute, and the idea of ownership versus custodianship, if that's a word,
Yes.
is tremendous, and you really get that. You realize we're here for a limited amount of period of time. The idea of ownership really is silly, but custodianship I get.
Yes, well, custodianship gets in the way of anybody who would claim a right to exploiting the resources of any part of the earth. I mean, at this stage, you can actually not even mention the name of God to see the simplicity of of the argument. Under custodianship, you see the earth as a giver, and your work as a way of harvesting what the earth is giving. Under ownership, you're saying that the earth owes you what it gives, and basically you have title over that, over whatever it gives, and in perpetuity, depending on which man-made system you have. In other words, ownership that places you in sovereign relationship to a piece of territory is really the way that mankind declares himself God over that which, quite simply, he has not created. He did not create the air he breathes that keeps him alive. He did not create the water that he drinks to keep him alive, and so on down the fundamentals to survival. Yet this bogus claim to sovereignty over these things, is made simply because in mankind's opinion, there isn't anybody, it seems, tough enough to contradict him. And subsequently, this is where we end up down the line through history. This is where conflict begins, in terms of this territorial acquisition of various resources that is given by the earth. The custodial thing, on the other hand, just simply says that I'm here to harvest through my own work, and the only thing I own is that which I create. So if I cut down a tree, the earth owns the tree that I cut down, but if I turn that tree into a chair, I own that. All right, do you see the difference
Yes.
between the two? But the
Yes.
earth will always own, the earth will always be sovereign over its ability to produce those resources. You can't do it. We can't do it. Nobody can do this sort of stuff. So we're dependent on this thing, this planet that we exist on. We're dependent on its creation, and where we move into Christian territory and religious territory is we are by extension dependent on whoever or whatever created.
Yeah.
Uh,
Now, so based on that, recently, there's a book I remember reading a story in it. It's called Kahuna Healing. It's a Hawaiian way of healing, and the guy's name is Serge King. In the beginning of the book, he talks about how he was introduced to this society, so to speak, but that his father, during some expedition in northern Africa, during a sandstorm, fell into a cavern, which happened to be an underground room that was filled with treasure.
mhm.
And one of the things that he had that he was able to get out of there before the sand caved in was this necklace. And this necklace basically had the nine planets on it with the yellow with jewel, all different colored jewels that represented each planet with the sun in the middle. And his father took it to somewhere in England to get it to say, what is this? What does it represent? And at that point, there was a special group of people that came to visit him and said that they were part of a society.
Sorry.
They took possession of it, but they said we don't believe that you came across this by chance, so we're bringing you into the society. And but the whole idea was that there's like an ancient knowledge that there's of who we are, that there's an active group of participants trying to take this knowledge from us,
Mhm.
from history, to not let us know where we are. And then from a lot of the stuff I go into conspiracy theory, I said, well, I wonder if that has anything to do with the idea of Darwinism and evolution and atheism growing, saying, no, you are an animal that evolved. That puts us into the ground, that the earth is actually the primary thing, and that there is nothing spiritual, that we are
Yeah.
man, and we've evolved to the edge of man as who we are, as opposed to something outside of ourselves that is God that created us. And it seems like there's something, and I gather it probably with the Saturn death cult information that you've gone through, there's some kind of connection between the two, or am I just imagining this?
No, no, I would go so far as to say that Darwinism and even Freudian psychology along those lines, they're probably the two most influential philosophies in the last 300 years, amongst humans. What it does essentially is it places man at the top of the food chain, and by rights of that placement, we claim sovereignty, legally speaking, of the earth. We're the highest evolved, species on the planet, and thereby, we can boss things around on that predication. But that is something, of course, that ancient wisdom would reject. Uh, and really, ancient wisdom, irrespective of where you look at it, says that by virtue of this uh, high sentient position that we hold on the planet, we actually have a responsibility to it. Not see again, sovereignty comes down to the idea in mankind that you're owed a living, you're sovereign, and therefore you're owed uh, a living by that which you are sovereign over. And to me, this is fundamentally the mindset of those people who would seek to have sovereignty over the planet today. And all they've done is they've created various control mechanisms, mostly financial, a lot of them religious and even military. The most successful by far being the financial control mechanisms. But they've done this purely to determine for themselves the status of being sovereign over a planet and its resources. And this falls apart just purely on the basis of when you question: did you make the air? Did you make the earth? Did you bring the rains? Did you create the whole cycle of life and death that drives our agricultural process, and such? And when put in that perspective, really honestly, their claims are puny in terms of what they claim they are sovereign over.
But does it seem like that there's an active process to get rid of any kind of thinking that opposes that, or any kind of history that might have people question that?
Yes, I do believe that down through time, and especially in the this era of mass media and so on, that we are actively being led to be, number one, less critical. If I was given that a biblical perspective, the idea of testing the spirits, this has been taken away from us, uh, and essentially the overriding philosophical conspiracy behind this, of which Darwinism, Freudianism, and so on all support, is a thing called collectivism. And collectivism is the driving force between this, whether it's National Socialism in Nazi Germany, communism in Russia or China, and even today, we see the collectivist ideal being promoted by people who have Rhodes Scholarship backgrounds and so on. And it's there in the media. It's telling us all the time that the greater good is overrides the good of the individual. And whereas my own interpretation, uh, down through the ancient wisdoms, going back much further than even the writings of Moses, what I can deduce from this is that it comes down actually to the individual and his relationship with his environment and how he deals with that. And of course, obviously, with other individuals, but the individual is the unit that it starts with.
So, if we go back to again now how money is used in that
Hmm.
as a reference point, and I hope
Right.
you're okay with me going back to that with the
No, I
idea
think
of
absolutely essential to give a perspective.
it
Uh,
is debt itself and money itself set up to create a distraction or a non-critical part. I remember, I think I talked to you in the last interview about a friend of mine where, he was a builder and building $1 million houses, multi-million-dollar houses, and he got to the point where he was, borrowing money from credit cards to pay money for other, and he's borrowing one, excuse me, and all that was interesting to him at the time was, this is going to destroy my credit. This is going to. I said, you don't have any credit. Credit is an illusion. Debt is an illusion. This is all a set. And it took me hours of talking to him until there was a certain point where he got that dissociated part where he was out. He kind of jumped out of it and was looking back at it and was realizing that's not who I am because he's a pretty spiritual man. And he's like, whoa, wait a minute, that isn't me. That's just an identity that I've. But it took away a lot of critical thinking in his mind because he was in so much debt.
Sure, yeah, and again, biblically, we're told that the debtor, is always slave to the lender in terms of that, and it does tend to have that effect. You become completely and utterly focused on servicing whatever debt you might have, but the debt itself that we often battle against, whichever individual in American society, British society, any society in the world as it is today, really the fundamental problem goes back to the age-old um, adage that if I give you $10 and those printed notes are the only $10 that exist on the planet and they cannot be forged, and so on. And I say to you, at the end of the day, at the end of the year, I want 11 of those back. I've just asked you to do the
Yes.
impossible, and basically, if I then say that if you can't give me 11 after having conned you into doing that, I'm going to take everything you own or everything you think you own. I'm going to have title over it. But Mark, really, for many people, all the talk about the cosmological background of mythology and mythology's archetypes, registering of archetypes, and how it affects us today, where most people can really get a handle on how it affects them on a day-to-day living, goes back to your question of what is, you said, what is debt or money? I put it down to just what exactly do we define as money? When people can understand what money is and make the distinction between money and currency, and then make the distinction between currency and debt, all right, then
Yes.
they start to get a handle that at the end of the day, we have been we have fallen for the most incredible con job, and this happens all the way through history. And there's moments where people rebel against it and they throw them off. You gave me an article to read that was, very good. A few things I didn't quite agree with it in terms of the historical analysis, particularly with the medieval times. But basically, you get tyrants or people of popular people who repudiate the debt, and then it starts again. The debt builds up, and then we have a chaos where it's repudiated, and we've had, some extreme examples of that through history. At least five that I can think of that were of an extreme nature, where people repudiated the debt. Then it starts up again. But this con
Repudiate.
job,
Excuse me for a minute.
got rid of it. Just, said we're not going to pay it.
So the people said that, or the people that the money were owed to said you don't owe it anymore. So was
No,
it
no, that has only, in my opinion, that's only happened once in documented history, where debt forgiveness has taken place, without some kind of catastrophic uprising or basically change, collapse of government or as such. And that would be Tiberius Caesar releasing his entire personal fortune
Yeah,
to the
we
people.
talked about that last time too. That
Yeah.
was very interesting. So the idea so that happened one time. All the other times it's been repudiated, and basically probably there was some kind of violence
Sure, it's
with it.
repudiated by the debtors, by the people who owe the money. They just can't take it anymore. And eventually somebody comes up and says, "This is crazy. This is, we're at it. We're at that point now. Look at Spain, look at Greece, and so on." I read a blogger called Mike Shedlock, Miss Shedlock. He's known in financial circles, and he often says the first politician that comes up and says we are not going to pay that debt, and they could go to hell, the bankers and so on, will be elected, will come to power. Now, in the past, you know, that person, the last time somebody came to power on that ticket, was a guy called Adolf Hitler, and we all know the subsequent, history from that episode.
Oh, so
But
he was repudiating the debt, and that's one of the ways he came to power.
well, he didn't. Yes, he was a great campaigner for repudiating the war reparations that were imposed on Germany after the First World War, which Germany tried to get out of by engineering a hyperinflation. That, of course, was one of the reasons that Germans, quite simply, are acting as they are in Europe in the current crisis. They have this memory where bread went from $1.30 in US dollar terms to, I think it was something like 33 trillion dollars or something like that in the space of a year.
It's
Uh,
probably not a bad memory to have in your conscious, right?
yes, exactly. So people were destroyed, and of course this this basically created uh, um, made the ground fertile for the rise of National Socialism, and National Socialism did in fact institute a form of monetary policy that was almost exactly as was instituted by the founders of the United States back in 1776 with the Constitution, and that was that the coining of money, or the printing of money, or the printing of currency, was the work of the state, and it was done not as a debt. It wasn't introduced into society as a debt. So there's a big argument to be said that despite the Nazi reputation for all the atrocities that they committed, there was also in the early 30s, people weren't worried about what was happening to the Jews. People weren't worried about the racist policies of fascism and so on. What really scared them was what they were doing with money, particularly the Anglo banking establishment.
Oh yeah.
All right, so essentially the Second World War was engineered, and that's we went down that line. But basically, that was an example in Nazi Germany. But down through the history, going back, the article that you gave me gives you some examples of Athens in the time of Aristotle. Where people just come and say, "We're not paying this debt. We shouldn't pay this debt." Now, in almost all cases, this ends violently. And Europe will become very violent, probably over the next 3 to 4, 5 years, as a result of this crushing debt that they are being forced to repay. So,
Can I
you know,
stop you for a second right there
yes.
on that point? Let's talk about that aspect of it because
Hmm.
obviously, it's all based on the same system interconnected, and where one domino falls, they're probably all going to fall.
Hmm.
And how does what excuse me, what starts the violence? So people say that's it, we're not going to pay this
Hmm.
anymore. And what have kings and queens and the money brokers done throughout history once people said we're not paying this debt? Which the kings and queens have to know they can't pay the debt.
Sure. And when you say kings and queens, the um, what I would class possibly the single greatest documented financial disaster in history was a result of one such king, Edward III of England, saying, "I'm not going to pay the debt to the Bardi and Peruzzi families of Florence." They were the banking powerhouses of that time. This is about the year 1335 to 1345. And of course, historians, including the guy who wrote the article you sent me, have subsequently said, well, if Edward III had basically lived up to his debts and paid them off, there wasn't a problem. But this doesn't tell half the story, because Edward was a very, very small amount of what the Bardi and Peruzzi family were actually doing throughout Europe at that time. He was so small that if you look at documents at the time, he was really just a small department within their whole sort of financial system, and he was referred to as Messer Edward, not even King Edward. They had no respect for him whatsoever. They had no respect for what it was doing to the British economy at that time. And essentially, they were doing exactly the same thing to virtually every other economy that they could get their hands on in Europe. And what really happened to the Peruzzi and the Bardi families was a combination of two things. They got in the same situation as the subprime lenders did back in 2007, where all it took was a 5% default rate, wherever that might come from, to really start to question whether they could cover their reserves. And essentially, what Edward III represented to the Peruzzi and Bardi banking interests was basically a Lehman moment for that kind of 5% small default thing. Do you remember back in 2008, people were saying, but hey, it's only 5% of
Yeah.
loans
Lehman
are going. Why
Brothers.
we got all these problems?
Yeah.
And it's simply because of this fractional reserve lending and interest and so on, and just lending upon lending upon lending. And these bankers were doing that back then. And history has tried to put them as, worthwhile free enterprise guys who got stiffed by the King of England. No, it was going to collapse. It was in the process of collapsing before Edward got it right and said, we got to get out of this. All right. And that's what will happen in Europe. At some point, somebody in Europe will say exactly the same thing that Edward said. And he will say, we just got to get out of this and cut our losses and basically, let them come after us if they can. Now, the
Bigger
other,
version of Iceland, maybe.
yes. Well, let's face it. Who talks about Iceland in the in the mainstream media these days? And yet, there is your classic example of how to deal with the IMF and the gang they call the Troika
Yeah.
that runs the whole thing.
Did I?
Iceland's done the business.
I tell you, when I was in Russia, I don't know if I relayed this to you last time. When I was speaking in Russia back in 2009, Moscow, and then we went to oh, I can't think of it, Siberia, Novosibirsk, and then
Oh
we went
yes.
ended up in St. Petersburg for a vacation. And when I was in St. Petersburg, getting up in the hotel in the morning, going down to eat, it was pretty busy. And one of the guys came and said, there's no chairs. Can I sit with you? And I'm like, absolutely. Well, he was from Iceland.
Hmm.
And we started talking. I said Iceland. I immediately I go like, oh, you guys are having fun with your bankers and your financial system over there. And I'm like, I love what you're doing. And this guy got so serious. He goes, we will hunt them down
Yeah, and they
throughout the
have.
world, and we will find them. We will bring them back. We will either make them reparations, or we will jail them, or kill them. We will
Yeah,
hang them. And
yeah,
I'm like, you're serious, Archie? He goes, we are serious in Iceland. We will do this. And now just I'm wondering, wow, I wonder who that guy was that I was talking to. You
well,
know, uh,
that's just good. I'd say it's good to hear. I know, because quite simply, I think the scoundrels that have perpetrated these things on the Iceland people, and to be perfectly honest, on all of us, probably deserve nothing less in terms of in terms of what they've done. So
Well,
yeah,
so let me. This is what I got to. This is the crux of it, where I see that when I've talked to people about this, this is where a lot of people get stuck. What is required from us spiritually if the debt was a con? If you're conned out of money, do you owe the money? And what do we do with it where we repudiate it and say, no, no, this is no, this you've set me up in a system. Yeah, a lot of times people say, well, the ignorance is not a form of defense,
right,
and but the deal is it's a system wide. But people want to do the right thing, but
yeah,
yet they're caught up with the idea that they've been conned, and a
mm,
part of their brain doesn't want to see they've been conned because then they look like fools or idiots that we really, in a sense, have been to get into the con. But in another sense, we're conditioned to it into it as children and have no idea. Where do you get to the point to say, wait a minute, this is a system that I'm in. I don't want to be in this. Number
Yeah.
two part of that question is, and this is the reason I believe nothing happens, what do we do in its place?
Right. Yes. And it's something that we definitely need to discuss today in terms of how do you go about this idea of repudiating what's there, what legal ground do we stand on, how does it go about doing itself, and my own studies, you know what I see possibly happening is actually a self-correcting um, process, which is in tune with how biblical law would be carried out in terms of its timescales. Now, that sounds like a very odd way of putting down, basically saying prophecy said that the greatest repudiation of the system would take place once at a certain time in the future and not before then. My own personal belief is that we are very close to that particular that episode. That previous episodes of repudiation just were not the right time, and that therefore the mandate that this system had to basically be the kingdom on earth is the only way I can put it. A kingdom of merchants. They were given a period of time to be a kingdom of merchants, bring forth the fruits, and after that period of time, when it finishes, they are judged, and it's the end of them. Now, that's a very complex interpretation of prophecy, which we can get into later. But until we understand what money is and how the con goes down, and what
Currency is.
what currency is and so on like that, we're not going to recognize the signs. And to be perfectly honest, I would say that there is almost an aha moment as to what is going on right before our eyes with quantitative easing, with the bond buying program that the ECB is doing, with what the Japanese central bank has been involved in, and what the Swiss central bank has been involved in, and particularly also the Bank of England, which is more at the center of this than a lot of people realize. And when you have that clear understanding of what money is and how the con goes down with regards money to create this massive cycle of debt that we're all in, then it becomes clear.
So the idea of like when I talk to people and I'll say, but like the 11th marble deal. Okay, you got 10 marbles in the can. Now pull 11
Yeah,
marbles out. You're just not
you
going to
can't
do
do
it.
it. That's
And
right.
people that will say, well, they'll just borrow more money into the system, but it's almost like they can't get they can't grasp this idea that they've only put 10 in, whether
Mm.
it's in digital form or real form, and then they're doing the idea of they're lending more out but expecting more back, and it
Yeah,
can't. It's
well,
like
to take your marble thing, that's actually, I hadn't thought of it in that way. It's an excellent way of describing it, because when they say just borrow more money in, i.e., borrow an 11th marble in, all
correct.
right, the next time they open up that can, they're expected to have 11 marbles and 1/11th of a marble,
Yes.
all right? So where's the 11th marble? Oh, we'll borrow it in.
Yes.
Okay, so you borrow in that. But then you see, there's this at the beginning. This is a wonderful way of creating more money and stimulating an economy. All right, there's no doubting it. It's a fantastic system. But as long as an interest or an increase is placed on whatever is borrowed into that system, all right, you never ever have enough marbles to pull out to match the number you're supposed to pull out.
Yes.
It never happens. The only way that would ever be stopped is if that 11th marble was given debt free.
Yes. Which they're not going to do because
No way.
they're coming from a system of control, not a system of
That's
fairness.
right. As long as they have that unobtainable marble, all right, that they can lend to you, all right, but you can never ever make over and above what the marbles that you have. As long as they have that over you, and as long as the deal is, if you can't pay it back, you forfeit whatever property, whatever you create for yourself. These guys have, and this is the con job. It is actually the con job. Uh, Anybody, any sensible person, when it's put to them like that, would say, "Well, I'm never going to even take the first original 10 marbles. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Why would I take the 10 marbles and let these guys have that?" All right. And this is where we come back to what is money and how did the archetypes out of mythology give these people the authority to basically convince us as a corporate whole to accept their marbles as our currency. In terms of that, and again, what do in that scenario, in that analogy, what do the marbles represent? They are currency that represent the the thing that we all accept as money, and this is the crucial distinction that people must make: that the dollar that they have in their pocket, or as a binary code number on their bank account statement, whatever it is, whatever representation it is the unit measure of whatever we will accept as a claim on our productive labor, or whether it be a good or a service.
Yes.
All right, that's all it is. That's what it is. And societies have to do that simply because that's how you expand trade and currency. When they get together as a government, two things that government undeniably have to do: one is serve as a way of protecting the people from outside threats, and two, have power over the issuance and standardization of currency.
Which was in our original
Totally,
Constitution
totally. Ron Paul
until,
talks about that all the time,
yeah.
and so
So
on.
so we've got this, and again, the crux of it is, I'm going to put another little personal story.
Mhm.
Um, I was at McDonald's. The McDonald's up here is in a place called Weed, California,
Mhm.
and it's got just this incredible view. So I'll sit there, drink my coffee, and look at Mount Shasta, which is 14,170 or 90. They're arguing back and forth between, is it 167 or 197? It may have grown because it's a volcano. But
Uh,
anyways, I sit there and looking at it, and something came into me where it was just like, what happens if this complete financial system goes? And the dollar's not worth anything anymore. What and there was this vacuum. It's like, what do I do? Where do I put this, my faith, in a sense? Where do I
yeah.
put, well, how am I going to trade? How am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to pay the mortgage? How am I going to pay the car? How am I going to buy food? How what and it, there and I think, and my sense is that no matter what we talk about, until we can get where we're going to go. Even when I'm working with people and doing therapy, we can figure out what the problem is, but the brain, the mind, the unconscious mind will not process that unless it knows and has a substitute
Right.
to put in its place.
Yeah.
What because the bridge then becomes, here's the substitute, here's the coinage, whether it's Bitcoin on the internet or whatever it is,
Right.
here's the deal, and now they can start to say we have a safe, because safety in the human brain, we go back to the limbic system. When we get afraid or start to talk about these concepts, they're so big that they
Mhm.
scare people. And the unconscious mind goes, delete, delete, turn off, turn off. We're not going to let you understand this. Your belief systems are something else. It's just not true. Say, the cognitive dissonance is too much.
Mhm.
But if they start to have, say, look, there's another system that's going to be coming in here. There's another system that is going to, be based on, biblical or constitutional principles.
Right.
How do we deal with that?
Yes. Well, okay. Number one, you can't deal with that until such a time as the existing system does actually collapse. All right.
So it's a double
So
bind in a way. It's kind of a
it is.
paradox, double bind. Gotcha.
It's a while it's functioning. All right. The way that the current system works on is that there are enough people who think they will get ahead, get that 11th marble, all right, by taking it from other people. There are enough people that can do that to inspire others that they too can also be like that, and basically the proportion of us that just never come up with the 11th marble and forfeit all our property and so on to those who are dishing out these marbles. These people. go by the wayside, and we all go, it's very sad, and maybe we'll pay some taxes and give them a helping hand and so on like that, okay? But eventually, that group of people who fail gets larger and larger and larger. Now, when I
Yes.
say larger and larger, people think, oh, yeah, well, when it gets to what, 50%, all right, or 60%? No. The news to most people is that when it gets to 5%, that's when you got problems. That's when a system has massive problems.
Really,
The
just again,
It's a 5%. Yeah.
the layman switch is maybe we can call it, and not layman is the layman working out on the property. Layman is Lehman Brothers
Hmm.
5%. That there's a magic to the 5% number based on the stability of the system as it is now.
Well, in terms of what studies have been made on just simply straightforward revolution, political, military, technological revolution, whatever you like, there's this 5% threshold. Only 5% of the American colonists rose up against British domination to create the United States. Only 5%. Uh, we get the sense that there was a sort of roiling 90% of the American people just had enough and down tools and took up guns and away off they went. No,
Yeah.
it was a dedicated 5% who said this is the end of it. This is what we're going to do. Now, of course, that 5% needed to have what you're talking about, a replacement for that. Now, the people who have come down through the ages who control the money system in at various phases down through times have largely been aware of this capacity of a 5% to overthrow. And when you get the system up to a breaking point, quite often they've reverted to the idea of financing the 5%, so they're in on the ground floor when the new 5% come through. Now you can definitely show historically that this was the case in the Soviet Union at the beginning with Lenin's uh, revolution, the Russian Revolution of 1917. Uh, I actually wrote a thesis on this at university when I was taking my politics part of my double major, and it was the only one I ever got an A plus for. And in it, I actually argued under a guy called Barry Gustafson, who was the top professor at the time and became a political entity in New Zealand himself. He asked, was the revolution, what's the word, indigenous, or did it come from outside sources? And I argued that it was entirely outside sources on the basis that Lenin was financed by the Warburgs.
New York
Um,
City.
yeah, well, New York City with the Trotsky side of the
Yep.
equation.
Yep.
That what was it, 20 million in gold in a ship
Yeah.
that the Canadians stopped. This is all documented. I produced all the documents. This is not internet conspiracy theory that's plucked out of whatever dubious sources you might have. You can go and see the newspaper articles where this was printed at the time, and Jacob Schiff and Kuhn Loeb and all these people were heavily involved, and the Canadians were told under no certain terms, you let that ship go. And that ship arrived in Murmansk, and as I say, the rest is history. It was completely financed, whereas the real revolution in Russia was taking place under the Mensheviks, who had a debt repudiation policy. And the Bolsheviks moved in, and through the financing, were able to overtake that system and started up the Soviet Union, which became the antithesis to the thesis that was the Western world, and so on. So you have this idea that they get in on the ground floor with revolutions. I would argue that the American Revolution was the one that nearly got away from these people. I would
Gotcha.
say that the likes of Franklin in particular, Washington, not to such a great degree, but certainly Franklin and Jefferson, these guys knew what the problem was. They knew they had to get out, that it wasn't the King of England they were rebelling against, it was the tax regime of the King of England that was required to service England's debts to the bankers. All right. This was basically what was being thrust upon the American colonists at the time. And when they successfully rebelled and started their own currency, colonial script, and so on, and they made it as, I think it was Franklin who absolutely insisted on that provision that only Congress has the right to coin money. Um, but within a year of his death, Alexander Hamilton was in
Yeah.
on the act with the first, national bank,
Thanks.
and the process started, but they didn't. The revolution in America was so strong that it took them to 1913 before they finally captured financially the American people.
Well, the Coin
And
Act, I remember the Coin
yeah,
Act of what, 1797 or
right.
1796? It
Hmm.
says if you in any way devalue this, it's punishable by death.
Absolutely.
Uh,
It was based on silver, wasn't it?
Silver, yep.
Yeah.
The Coin Act, and to any way, there, I can't remember exactly what the wording was. I posted it on Facebook recently. It's funny when I get into this stuff and post that, I don't get any responses.
Right.
It's almost like it scares people so bad.
Yeah.
But that's how adamant they were.
Absolutely. And the most frightened people at that time were the banking cabals centered in London and Paris. These people were terrified of the precedent that was being met there. Their financial losses were extreme. The British Crown was not going to be able to pay back the debt and so on. So, you know, I think really anybody who is honest about the history from there on in knows that there was a concerted campaign from that time to reintroduce the same financial system that had taken over Britain when the House of Rothschild cleaned up after the Battle of Waterloo back there. They,
when
it
they
was
told them that the Battle of Waterloo had been lost and everybody sold everything and then
Oh,
they
he knew
bought
the
it
Battle
all.
of Waterloo had been won, but he acted
Yeah,
as if
yeah,
it had been lost. He didn't even say anything. He just stood there
yeah,
and gave everybody the perception that all was not well. And then he bought everything up on pennies on a dollar,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
the rest is fabled history in terms of their wealth. The first trillionaires,
Yes,
to exist. Well, their various cohorts, mostly through the Warburg family and the Schiff family and so on like that, ultimately managed to persuade one J.P. Morgan and so on to get heavy on the banking system in America and present this idea of what we call the Federal Reserve Act, which was passed into law. But you had one president there, Andrew Jackson.
yes,
They tried to kill him.
yes. Stonewall.
Yeah, was he Stonewall? Is it? Is it? I
Yeah,
thought he was a Confederate guy.
Stone
Um,
was it? And Andrew Jackson.
I think Andrew Jackson was in the 1830s. He was the guy who said, "If there's one thing I'm proud of,
Oh
it's
yes, yes.
I killed the bank."
Yeah,
All
Aaron
right,
Burr. Didn't he get into some altercation with Aaron
that's
Burr?
right. He's
Yeah.
the only
Okay.
sitting president to fight a duel.
Yeah.
So he's a tough guy.
Yeah.
And you need guys like that. I've got a quote on Saturn Death Cult from him, which outright says, and this is a sitting American president, outright says it's a bunch of families that are doing this. And this goes to whoever you follow in terms of the whole banking cabal conspiracy, whether it's Tex Miles with his ideas on the Rothschilds and so on like that, and going down through the Bilderbergers. You know, a sitting president called Andrew Jackson was under no delusion as to what and who was behind the attempt at putting America under a debt-based financial system again. And of course, they finally did win out after then, and I think the Second National Bank was formed. And of course, this was the one that Abraham Lincoln fell foul of.
Yes.
And when he printed greenbacks
Greenbacks. Yep.
and so on, and of course, I think it was he started printing greenbacks, and I think it was a matter of months before a bullet entered his skull. And the next guy to do the same thing was Kennedy, with about the same timeline before a bullet hit his head.
Yes.
So the circumstances and the evidence and the actual words of these people, all right, are there on the record for anybody to see that there has been a concerted effort to rein the United States in since 1776 back into the fold of the Western banking system that came out, in my opinion, established in Britain out of the Dutch concerns and so on that they had. But this goes all the way back into those groups of people who arrived in Rome from the Middle Eastern nations, Persia and so on, right back to Babylon itself. And this system has been vying for control, winning, losing, It's never been more in control than it has been in the
Right.
last 10 years.
Yes.
And yet now it never faces a bigger crash than it does today.
So it's facing the crash. They're in control. They've had more control. Less people are aware of who they are. More people are aware something is wrong. So there's different forces working here, but they have to know. I mean, they're smart enough. Like when I heard Alan Greenspan said, we had 100 PhD. I had 100 PhDs working underneath me, and we had no idea what these derivatives were. And I'm like, BS. You knew
Yeah.
exactly what these derivatives were, and you knew what it was going to do. They have to know the mess they've gotten themselves in. They had to know hundreds of years ago where this was going to go, and eventually it was going to build up to this level. And they're saying now quadrillions in derivatives and back and forth
Sure.
that could fall, like I said, at any moment on a smaller percentage than 5%. So they've got themselves backed into a corner in a sense, but they don't seem to be stopping. What's going on with that?
Okay. There is a third player, I believe, involved. The works of Joseph P. Farrell, in his books. He's written a book called Babylon's Banksters.
Yes. Yep.
He's also he also is very hot on the topic of what he calls the Nazi International, and essentially what he argues for is that there is a critical mass in these debt-based systems that is reached. And I have actually been asked by a lot of people, surely this is just yet another engineered crash for these guys to clean up, for these guys to grab all the uh, property that they can get their hands on. They'll just, reformulate the system and present it with pink dollars next time or something like
Yes.
that.
Yes.
All right, okay. This is what people fear. People who have even come to an understanding. Yes, these guys have got us, and this is really a controlled crash, a controlled scenario on their part. The answer to that is yes, that does happen. The 1930s, which was a cakewalk in comparison to what we are actually going through now. Such as it's given to us as the worst of the worst, but it wasn't nearly as bad as where we are right now and are going,
I agree.
in the world. But that was a classic example of um, uh, sending out credit, restricting credit, and creating a crash that allows people to then clean up and establish an even greater control. And that's happened quite a few times in various parts of history where it's done. It just makes good business sense. It's a way of killing the opposition, and creating a monopoly as opposed to a free market system, which is really at the center of financial capitalism as opposed to what Henry Ford called constructive capitalism. And essentially, the critical mass is reached, and if they don't get it done before that, all right, if they don't crash the system and start off again from before that system, then it gets out of their control.
So if they
Now,
don't volitionally crash it, if they don't
correct.
intentionally crash this thing.
If they don't intentionally crash this thing, or if they don't find a way to expand, okay, the China was the great hope. Dump a whole lot of money into China and investment and so on, and we can expand because the con job is it's a Ponzi scheme, as many people have been talked about. You just got to keep expanding. All right, you've got to keep pumping more money into more suckers, and it's just got to keep going up further and further. But it reaches a point where the expansion of their credit supply just simply doesn't match the productive capacity of whoever is within the system, and that is your biggest clue to where we're at with this particular phase of the system.
So
Uh,
say that again, Troy. Say that again, maybe in a little different way, so we can.
okay, the amount of money that enters into the system, all right, which enters into the system via debt, that is, it's given as an interest loan, all right. It works as long as the productive capacity of those receiving the money expands, i.e., more jobs are created, more products are made, and so on. So if you get a situation where a new technology comes on the scene, the most recent computers, software, that sort of thing, you get an expansion which can soak up the extra amount of credit that these banks introduce into the system.
Ah, yes, okay.
When you reach a point where there is no new technology, no must-have device that everybody's got to buy and such, right? Where there is no expansion of to fulfill demand by consumers, whatever, then basically money starts to become a commodity in its own right. All right, it starts to be traded just simply as money for money. All right, as opposed to simply a facilitator of goods and services
So
within the economy.
that would be like what the Fed is doing, loaning it at 0%,
Yep.
to the banks. The banks are then buying bonds at 2% and doing nothing, not lending people money for businesses or homes because they're not going to take any loss, and they're getting
That's right.
2% on their money for doing nothing.
Yeah, all these are just symptoms of the greater problem, and that is too much money has been put into the system at interest, all right, to create the national debt and so on like that, okay? And basically, what is actually being made, the things that we make, the things that we do to help, to sell to other people, that other people need, whether it's a service or a good, has not kept pace with what they're doing in the financial world. And the only reason that it hasn't kept pace, the only reason they've lost control, is because the whole debt aspect, that 11th marble that we talked about, all right, has literally taken on a life of its own, and it can't be serviced by the capacity of the production that we have as economies, including the Chinese, including America, the most productive nation in history. It just doesn't match what they have. It doesn't compensate for for the continuing growth of that 11th marble,
So what?
compounded.
So if we go on that point there, what stops them from saying, look, we're at 200 or we're talking about 1 quadrillion. Now they're talking about like a lot more. Than it just keeps
Mm-hmm.
growing exponentially as we find out more about it. These guys at the top got to go. Look, this is 100 trillion to you and 100. Let's just
Yeah,
let's just knock this off and start again, and not
exactly.
start again, but at least bring it back to a manageable level.
Yep.
What
And this
stops them
comes
from
this
doing that?
comes right back goes back to the Tower of Babel, and um, it goes all the way back to the ancient wisdoms and so on. What stops them from doing this, Mark, is the thought of loss of control. That gives them a control. All right. All of that debt tells them that there is a small group of private interests, whether it be the people behind the Federal Reserve, whether it be the people behind the City of London, and all the other various interests. A very small minority of people, if they have to forgive this debt, because that's what we're talking about, they lose it all. They lose all their control over a claim on all of that perceived wealth. All right, and that is the problem that they face. And the funny thing is it's great at the beginning, the system, to do that for them. The Rothschilds and people like that, they can plan way ahead, generations ahead, for this kind of thing to work in their favor. But
It's
it
all
reaches
math,
a
right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's basic
it's exactly,
mathematics.
it's critical mass, it's mathematics, and it reaches a point where it cannot sustain itself. So when I said earlier on, I see a self-defeating solution for bringing us into a new solution. What I bringing us into a new era of economy where this system
Sure.
collapses on itself. What we've now reached the point at is that these institutions that create the debt are legally, under the system that they have created, taking the debt back. All right, they're pretending to pay for it to um, to hold up the illusion that the debt has been serviced.
Yes.
All right, so there's this massive debt out there that they've lost control of, and the lost control of mathematically, not because they haven't got enough goons with machine guns or whoever to go around and threaten people. It's just mathematically out of control. And there are too many interests out there that are going to say, well, if this goes, then this person owes, and it creates a domino effect down the line, and they know this is going to happen. So what happens? The main perpetrators of this system, the central banks, uh, who who set up this whole deal in the first place, particularly with the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, these people are now saying, well, we will service the debt by buying it. All right. And so this is what quantitative easing is. It's
Q3,
monetizing
yeah,
of the debt. Okay.
yes.
And that's what they're doing. And they're putting it onto their books. All right. So we're at a situation. And the reason that they're putting it onto their books is because they simply believe that through the years they have gained enough control over the political entities that govern us and over us ourselves, the peoples and so on, that they can say, we're putting this onto our books as a favor to keep the system that you need to survive going. And at the end of the day, you will back it up if it all fails. All right. Okay. And we'll do
Nice,
that through
nice guys,
taxes.
right? Nice
Exactly.
guys.
This is their thinking. At the end of the day, they're willing to take on this debt. I mean, if you look at the European Central Bank's balance sheet, and if you look at the Federal Reserve, it's obscene the amount of debt they're now taking on
Yes.
to keep this game going that they have. Now, at some point, these people uh, will be confronted, as I said, with somebody who will stand up and have enough votes and live long enough to convince the people that this debt actually constitutes illegality on the part. Now, how are we going to do that? What are we going to appeal to actually class this illegal? The Icelandic people that we mentioned earlier on before, they're the only people who've put bankers in the jail so far in this situation. All right, but there is the clue there with these people as to how this will go about. It'll be nasty. It'll be a lot of people will get hurt, but the leadership in what I call Mystery Babylon, or this whole banking system that we have, are the ones who get it in the neck in this situation. And the legal requirement to be able to say, we're not paying because it is illegal what you have done, will be accessed by simply going back into our past and seeing what our legal system is based on, which simply goes right back to the laws of Moses, whether people like it or not. That's where your precedent actually comes from.
Wow. So, it, with this, people basically are going to have the things they need that money buys at this time to get them through until the new system, whatever
Oh,
that
most
is,
definitely.
pops up.
In one blog entry that I made on my website, I argued the case that if you want a historical analogy of how to navigate what's going on, look at the people of Judah in their exile in Babylon before Babylon fell to the Medo-Persians. All right, and if you take that as a template, uh, when they lived in Babylon, they did so because, if you remember, they went into captivity in Babylon because they had foregone God's laws when the kingdom of Judah existed with its capital in Jerusalem. They
Yes.
refused to observe the Jubilee, and they were told, observe the Jubilee, but because you've been a bad bunch and you haven't released all debt and released all slaves and so on as required every 49th year under that particular system, you will be placed in bondage of a wooden yoke to Babylon. I am sending Nebuchadnezzar, he's my servant in punishing you for this. All right. And Jeremiah made this, claim, the prophet Jeremiah. He walked into King Hezekiah's court with a wooden yoke over his shoulder, and he said, this is how it's going to be. You're going to be in bondage. You're going to have to pay tribute. But guess what? You get to stay in Jerusalem. You get to stay in Judah. To which a rival prophet, the actual official court appointed prophet, I think his name was Hananiah, he busts off the yoke and says, with a sword, off Jeremiah's neck, and he says, "No, this is how we're going to deal with the Babylonians and any yokes that get put over our neck." To which Jeremiah said, "Fine, it's going to be an iron yoke, not a wooden yoke, but an iron yoke." In biblical parlance, a wooden yoke symbolizes captivity within your own land under the Babylonians, and the iron yoke meant you were going to get deported. All
Uh,
right, you were going to be sent off into Babylon, and of course, what happened? These people ended up in Babylon. They were shifted over there, and the whole book of Daniel is really about one particular Judahite's experience living in Babylon in exile. When the Babylonian Empire fell, all right, as predicted in the book of Daniel, whether you want to believe that or not, we know that the circumstances were that Babylon succumbed to the Medo-Persians, who dammed up the Euphrates River and then walked in under the impregnable walls by simply walking in under a dry riverbed. And in one night, Babylon fell. This impregnable city fell in one night, and the leadership of Babylon was slaughtered all night. Now, the people who lived in Babylon, the average Joe Blows of that time, whether Babylonian or exiled Judahites, these guys woke up to just quite simply a change in leadership. Okay? And that change in leadership, within the space of 10 years, issued, as was Persian custom, a jubilee. All right? They completely repudiated all debts, and they said to the Judahites, "You're free to go back." All right? And that was
yes.
how the first rebuilding of the temple took place. These guys were allowed to come back. Now, if we take that as the idea that in 1913, and I'm appealing to many people with a Christian disposition in making this analogy. But if we take 1913 as a wooden yoke having been put on the necks of particularly the American people, and ultimately the rest of us through the fact that the American currency became the world reserve currency. If we take that as a wooden yoke, all right,
Yes.
then basically the American people have been in the captivity of Babylon
Within their own land.
within their own lands, and at some point there will be a repeat in history of, there'll be represent people who could be symbolically represented by the Persians and the Medes will come in and release the American people from their bondage in the way that the Judah people were released from the captivity in Babylon. And at that point, when they are released from that Babylonian system, that Federal Reserve system, all you need is 5% of people to start acting. And remember, the people who went back to Judah went back to Judah from Babylon in captivity were only a remnant. I think there were 17,000 of them out of two or 300,000 or
Yeah.
whatever. And I think I do seem to remember the numbers. They represented about 5% of those that were there. Even Daniel, the prophet of the people of Judah in Babylon, he never went back. He stayed in Babylon.
Wow.
And but the change for people to come out of that captivity of having to live under a Babylonian system was affected by this small remnant of people. And what I believe that tells us, for me, this is not sort of like, hey, I predict prophetically like an astrologer predicts what's going to happen next day. I
Yes.
just say that there is a model there for what goes on in countries that get released.
And you can
Okay.
predict based on a model. I mean, if you're,
Yes, exactly.
yes,
And I think that's really all prophecy is. It's an innate understanding of human nature and how and the consequences of human nature's actions when known laws are applied to it. In the case of the biblical prophets, there are known laws that God has that are still in effect, whether we like it or not. And these things affect basically the destinies of peoples and nations and individuals as we come down. But so if we take that as a template, Mark, uh, for what is happening to the United States, for instance.
yeah, what would
um,
that look like if we take our imaginations and just say, okay, based on that, projecting out on that model, not saying that this is the way
yeah,
it's going to be, but how, how do you extrapolate out? What
what
might
that
that look
looks
like?
like is a bankrupting, all right, of the Federal Reserve in a violent way, not the American government or such, but the Federal Reserve will be repudiated at some point, and whether the violence takes place in forced bankruptcy by Congress or quite literally calling out the National Guard. However that goes about, the Federal Reserve will crash, and it will be proclaimed that all that debt that was America's debt is now on the books of the Federal Reserve. It's bankrupt. It's null and void. All right. This is what I believe will ultimately take place at some point. When that happens, as you say, that leaves a void. That leaves people, struggling around. People will still be able to buy and sell. The US dollar that's printed in terms of paper will be available. People will still recognize its value within America. And you will get essentially local currencies. In other words, America will very much revert, I believe, to the America of the 1800s at various times, when individual banks at certain localities to their local communities issued currency against that community's output. The trouble being is that when you were living in Virginia and you wanted to trade with somebody in Arizona, they didn't necessarily recognize a Virginian bank's certificate or whatever, all right? So you'll go back into a system like that, which is semi-chaotic. Russia experienced a very similar thing at the end of it when the Soviet Union fell. And basically local currencies, local economies will start to happen. Drastic decline in standard of living, a huge increase in the value of those little bits of paper called dollars, all right, that you have for a time. And certainly anybody in precious metals who is going to do well. But for those who can actually make something, farm something, mine something, they'll do okay. However, from the perspective that I think is the most important, is in re-establishing a national currency, one that everybody in America accepts as money. There will be a 5% group of Americans who will go, we can't go back to a Federal Reserve system. We need a non-debt system. And to be perfectly honest, they only have to look at their own constitution to get the blueprint for this.
What about the North Dakota model that's going right now in America? Have you read anything
I
about
don't know about that, Mark.
Well, the
Yeah.
North Dakota is that's exactly what it is. It's more people are putting it out to be a socialist bank, but what it does is it's a non-debt based system. And if you look up the name Ellen Brown, and just put Ellen Brown North Dakota, you'll find all kinds of information on it. But
Ellen Brown, the author?
Ellen Brown, the author, yep,
Yes, I know her work, yeah.
yep, and her whole work is the culmination of it would be to get the North Dakota banking system, which is the state with the lowest unemployment. They're not in debt. They have a surplus. They're doing real well. But within the United States, there's other states now that are starting to say we want to start to incorporate state banks, but they're using the United States currency. But what they do is they don't lend it out at the interest rate, so that there's a certain amount of money that they're charging because there's the use of money, like a use fee,
Yes.
And based on that, they're booming there. And
Right.
now other states are starting to say, I think, that they think they want to incorporate this system. So people are becoming aware of it, and I don't know if that's what you're talking about or.
I would say so. I'd say that that sounds very similar to what happened on the Isle of Jersey after the Napoleonic Wars, when all the lads returned home from fighting Napoleon. And England basically, Jersey's a little island off the coast of France that's under British sovereignty. And these people arrived back, and they had all these strong young lads with no work, no longer an income because they were no longer in the military. And they had all these merchants and so on that had dilapidated market spaces and things like that, but they had no money, no official money, and until somebody said, "Hey, let's start issuing Jersey pounds," and believe you me, Jersey became a very nice place to live in the ensuing 100 years. But at some point, the Bank of England decided that enough was enough and clamped down on it under the guise of tax collecting. Got the backing for that. But really, all the North Dakota system and Jersey, what it suffers from in the end is imported inflation, especially if it's using existing currency. And this is why, in biblical terms, if you're going to have something like that, because that's essentially what the nation of Israel did, it set up its own currency, like you've described, similar to North Dakota, where it's non-interest. But what it did was it put a prohibition um, on lending at interest, which they're doing. But you could lend at interest to anybody outside of the system, i.e., to foreigners. Now, this has been the stuff of anti-Semitism for centuries, because Jews practicing this are seen as evil moneylenders and so on like that. And to a certain extent, they have created a problem for themselves by not fully understanding what was meant by this law. And that law simply meant that you don't want somebody coming into your system where you've got interest-free money lending going on, borrowing a whole lot of money, taking it outside the system and spending it in another place or investing it in another place at interest. All right. Okay. And
Yeah.
thereby perpetrating even more misery on those people under interest. Okay. In other words, a carry trade in interest, accounts is bearing accounts is what that stops. It's been abused as in, hey, you're a foreigner, I can lend at extortionate interest rates at you, and it usually ends very sadly for Jewish communities down through the centuries as a result of that. But that's essentially what it's about. It's to stop the interest being perpetrated on people outside of the system by unscrupulous members of that system coming in and borrowing money and taking that money out for the purpose of doing it. It cancels out any motive. What's the word? What's the word? Incentive to come in and borrow North Dakota money at low interest and go out and lend it again in Texas or something.
Well, what this brings up is that, it, and it might be something you want to consider doing, is to say to people, okay, this is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And since there's so much uncertainty about what's going to happen afterwards, here are some guidelines to go by when accepting your new currency. Here are some things to consider, some questions to ask yourself, what to look for
Mm-hmm.
in the people that are going to replace that void that's there. The five.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think that's something that we should end our chat with when we get come to it. I'm saying let's end now. I'm saying that's really the best way to end up on this, because given the scenario what I've put out in terms of what might happen to America in the coming decade or so, I think it's important that I also relate who plays the role of the Medo-Persians.
Yeah, that was the question I was going to ask you a little. I'm glad you
Yeah.
brought that back. In our imaginary scenario, which may end up happening, who are they? Who are the Medo-Persians today?
Well, what I believe, uh, if I say outright and then explain myself, is probably the best way. The Medo-Persians today will be the Russians and the Germans. There is an element of the Iranians involved in this, simply because they have the oil resources to complement certain things. But basically, the um, the interests that will put an end to the Anglo banking establishment that I identify as Mystery Babylon, Hidden Babylon, Occult Babylon, this hidden kingdom of merchants that have us at their, under
Behest.
captivity. All right. What I believe, where the main challenge is coming from, will be a combination of the Germans and the Russians. Uh, and, I think it's not um, insignificant that the heraldry of these two countries is derived from Medo-Persia. Uh,
Heraldry. Give me heraldry for those that might not.
okay,
This
heraldry is the symbolic use
coat of
of
arms and
yeah,
things.
coat of
Right.
arms, things like that. When you look at the heraldry, for instance, of Great Britain, you see the unicorn and the lion standing either side of the coat of arms of the sovereign, and so on. Okay, so and there's heraldry is a fascinating topic in its own right, and is highly linked in to these archetypes we were talking about from mythology.
Ah.
Um, there is a reason that King David is called the Lion of Judah. Um, there is a reason that the unicorn exists on the the British coat of arms. and such. It even extends to the United States seal with the eagle with widespread wings. All right, this is all heraldry, and heraldry was the record keeping of old to ensure just who was who and who had title to what. All right. Now, the heraldry of Persia has always been uh, the standing eagle. All right,
Yes.
The American eagle is wings outstretched. The Persian eagle is has often been has been wings outstretched, but there's also the standing eagle. Now, if you look at Tsarist Russia and even Russia today, they've readopted the double-headed eagle of
Double-headed.
Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And if you look at the German eagle, it's the eagle with the turned head, but the wings at rest. All
Yes.
right. Now these are Persian symbols, whereas the United States symbol, purposely chosen by the founders, is actually based off the House of Manasseh, which goes right back to the tribes of Israel. And this heraldry, you could say, had a biblical start when the patriarchs of Israel were described by their father Jacob as having certain traits, like animals. Judah is like a lion, a young lion.
Yes.
Benjamin is a wolf, a ravenous wolf. There's Ephraim um, is the rampant bullock, which when it's rampant and turned to the side, it becomes a unicorn. That's where the unicorn comes from, because you only see the one horn when it's in profile. So
Ah.
you have the you have you have the study of heraldry. It's very important, particularly to the people who run things at the very top, how the heraldry works and so on. Russia um, has readopted the heraldry that was completely repudiated by the communist government, and they've gone back to the eagle and such, which gives you a heraldic link. Now, that's not enough, in my opinion, to back up why I'm saying Germany and Russia are a part of this equation. If you remember, I mentioned Joseph Farrell, the alternative research,
Babylon.
Babylon's
The banks.
banksters,
Yep.
and so on. He's done a lot of stuff. He's done studies into the Cosmic War, which is a study of mythology. Giza Death Star, where he looks at um, ideas to do with that being some kind of a machine and so on. But in my opinion, his most fascinating work has been the Nazi International and the Babylon's banksters. And what he's done is he's laid out a, a, a very comprehensive scenario that shows that the phase that Babylon's banksters are in, which we would call the Anglo-American banking phase, which has been in power, quite literally since Bretton Woods, but really since the House of Rothschild took over things in Britain since about 1815. All right, this Anglo banking establishment financed a group of guys called Nazis as part of the whole Hegelian dialectic. You build up one lot, the Soviets in one case, and you build up the Nazis in another case, and you bring them into conflict to create a synthesis of results that you want. All right.
What
Uh,
is it? Thesis, antithesis,
Thesis, antithesis,
antithesis,
synthesis.
synthesis.
That's correct. Hegelian dialectic at its finest. There's a lot of Hegelian scholars who say, no, that's not what Hegel meant. But if that isn't what Hegel meant, then I can guarantee you the bankers thought that's what he
They
meant.
thought that's what he meant
And
exactly.
they ran with it. So the idea of financing the Nazis seemed pretty good at the time, because they needed another war, a controlled war. And when I say that things can get very chaotic, yet we also have times during a banking collapse, particularly one we're coming up to, and they've lost control. The mark of a controlled crash is one in which you have conflagrations, and there's no doubt the Second World War was a nasty piece of work. But what people do not realize about the Second World War was that American, British, and German banks were trading throughout the entire war. There was no stop to that trading. Something that seems inconceivable, in terms of a real conflict.
Yeah, we got
Uh,
Turkey and Syria right now, and they're both stopping flights go. So
yeah.
all that stuff begins to stop. Pull back the ambassador, stop the flights, stop the banking, stop.
Mhm.
And here we go in a full-fledged war, and you're
Yeah.
saying they're trading, having dinner, talking as if
That's right.
nothing's going
That's
on.
right. They're financing stuff left, right, and center, and so on, to the point that prior to the actual outbreak of hostilities, the little known what they call the was it the financiers coup or the bankers coup? I can't remember. Prescott Bush was involved in it. The big daddy of
George
George,
Senior.
yeah, George Senior, and there's a guy called Smedley Butler, a patriot American who blew the whistle on this. And it was an attempt to basically take America down fascist lines, which simply means corporate control, where America is at now.
Yeah,
All right, okay. And this is what they sort of attempted to do at the time when Hitler was really building up his resources and so on. Luckily, they were stopped by a patriot at that time, and it kind of delayed the process. But nonetheless, these banking establishments um, were very much still operating with each other, so that you had Wall Street concerns right through the Second World War, even after the outbreak of outright hostilities, still dealing with German interests, via Switzerland, whatever. The fact of the matter is, if you were dealing with the Warburgs and you were J.P. Morgan, that shouldn't be uh, happening in a genuine conflict. Um,
yes,
so that becomes my sort of ace in the hole in saying, hey, look, these guys aren't all that they seem to. J.P. Morgan might be an American bank. It doesn't belong to America. It is its own entity within an international cabal that is extranational.
yes,
And this is the fundamental thing that needs to be recognized. Now, that extranational cabal I'm talking about is what Farrell identifies as the Anglo banking establishment. And what happened was that they financed the Nazis. The Nazis got a little bit out of control. They had to bring things together, but there was a very clever individual, what Farrell refers to as a professional Nazi, a guy called Martin Bormann. And Martin Bormann probably constitutes what I call an illuminated one more than anybody else in recent history. Martin Bormann didn't give a fig about Nazi racial purity, about the philosophies. He paid lip service to Hitler and so on. What Bormann did was he was the third generation of Nazi that simply saw it as a professional vocation. And to do so, you've got to finance it. So near the end of the Second World War, Bormann gets together all of the industrialists of Germany into a famous meeting that's documented for all those who say this is conspiracy. These are all the IG Farben and Krupp and
yes,
these gigantic concerns. Siemens was in there. These names that we all know. And in pure gangster fashion that Al Capone could only dream of, basically says, right, give us your money, all right. And essentially, in that moment, he says the war's lost. You give us your money, and then we'll reinvest under different guises um, after the war, after the hostilities end. And this is essentially what he did. He creates this absolute maze of shell companies and so on, and he reinvests the money into the Anglo-American banking establishment. Now, you would think to yourself, well, that must be money for jam for the Anglo banking establishment. Here's a defeated group of people giving us all of the booty through untraceable money laundering techniques. Let's party. This
y-
is this is easy money. All right.
yeah,
The difference being is that what Farrell argues very well, in my opinion, is that Martin Bormann was not the kind of guy who wouldn't have thought of this. Martin Bormann knew he had the muscle to, when the market came due, when the payments came due, all right, he had the muscle to go in with these guys and say, if you don't pay, you're dead. Pure gangsterism, but this is the way it works. And that muscle that Bormann organized was quite literally a spreading of Germany's greatest scientists to 3 planes of orbit, uh, half off to the Soviets, half off to the Americans, so that by the height of the space race in the late 60s, it could be said when Americans said, "Why did the Russians beat us into space?" It's because their German scientists were better than ours.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. And of course, there was a whole lot of them that ran off down to Argentina. Okay. But these guys existed internationally, way ahead of their time in terms of how they thought. Borders were not an issue for them. The only thing that gelled them together was the financial uh, um, conduits and maze that Borman had created to finance the continuing researches of their scientists, and also to keep in check what essentially became Nazi cabals and outfits like NASA, and certainly in Russia and so on. There is also a tremendously strong case for Nazi involvement in the drug trade as another source of income and finance. The problem being is that at some point in the future, as I said, the marker comes due. And Farrell has speculated, and he does say it's speculation, but if you do the calculations, the initial bailouts, the 700 billion that Hank Paulson
Yes.
demanded, all this sort of stuff, that just, we're going to give it to them. There's no oversight, nothing. You need to give it now, or it's just tanks in the street tomorrow. All right. It seems to correlate with what might be owed to this Borman entity if, in fact, they did invest. In other words, what I'm saying, the calculated amount that Borman stole from Europe, whether it was from Jewish banking families, from German industrialists, whatever, the loot that they put in would have generated in the realm of the amount of money that the American banking establishment needed to put it, needed to bail itself out. Now, Farrell goes a step further, and he puts together this whole idea of where the European unity project called the European Union is actually going and what it's actually really all about. It is the elastic diplomacy that Bormann formulated near the end of the Second World War and would have applied later, that basically was designed to bring this time Europe under German control, not through bullets and tanks, but through debt enslavement. Okay, in which case it's the old fashioned idea that of I make you a debtor, you're my slave. All right, except that with the ultimate aim is that eventually Europe's gold reserves would actually back the solution to its debt problems when it reaches a certain point. So now we see Germany through Merkel and these people, they talk about collateral. If we're going to lend money to these prolific idiots down in Greece and Italy and Spain and Portugal and the Irish and all this sort of stuff, if we're going to do that, we want some collateral, right? Well, if you take the collateral as being precious metals, and you look at what Italy has, Spain, and so on, plus with what Germany has, you suddenly have a gold and precious metal reserve that is bigger than the United States' supposed reserves. There's a lot of doubt
Yes.
about the American reserves, but the
Yeah.
fact of the matter is that this seems to be one of the means that the German policy seems to be moving towards this. We don't care whether you get the money or not, as long as we get the collateral. What collateral? It would have to be particularly Italian gold and such, all right? So this seems to be a policy that the Germans are following, and it's a policy that then allows them to move into a situation of offering a new currency, but one that is backed by gold, okay, or backed by precious metals. If they do that, if they reach the point where they can offer a new international currency of trade backed by a gold thing, man, you will see a collapse in the US dollar overnight. You will see people will gravitate towards that currency as fast as they can, simply because for centuries gold has been seen as money.
Yes.
So if a new gold-backed Deutsche mark, or even it's called a euro, comes into the equation, That's what you get. Now, Germany is a strange country since the Second World War. We know that they militarily have been kept. You can't have soldiers anymore. You've caused too much trouble. Two world wars, and
Yes.
it's that's the end of you. We know that the United States has been the military superpower, since that time, with the only rival really having ever been the Soviet Union at the height of its power. With the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia sort of degenerated into, a lot. I've heard various descriptions. Bangladesh with missiles, this kind of thing became a non-entity in terms of that. However, Russia has always remained a 800-pound gorilla in terms of the military side of things. What a lot of people don't realize about the Germans, and this is where they're clever, so much of the German industrial outfits that Bormann, um, you could say euphemistically, reinvested their money after the Second World War. They've rebuilt, and a lot of people don't realize that Germany can go nuclear overnight for this reason. Germany builds all of France's nuclear capability, virtually. While France has its own nuclear power plants, the actual engineering and all the templates that go into its nuclear deterrent, which is formidable, is German designed. Well, not German designed as much, a cooperation with the Germans, but certainly, given the Germans' reputation for engineering excellence, the French have always been quite happy to let them have that, including the manufacture of submarines, but missiles and so on.
Yes.
So Germany has the capacity to assemble its own nuclear deterrent. What Germany does not have is the resources. All right, like Japan, they've always been resource starved. America, highly blessed throughout its history in terms of resources. The only country that comes close to the United States is Russia, and that's where you get a situation where Russia and Germany start to grow closer. And it's no mistake that Angela Merkel, the current leader of the German uh, the political leader at the time, only speaks Russian as a second language.
Wow.
All right, she doesn't speak English. I mean,
Wow.
one of the most amazing things of traveling in Europe is that they all seem to speak English. It's great if you're an English speaker
Yes.
and all
Yes.
that sort of stuff. But Merkel, she doesn't speak English. She chose Russian. All right. And there has been a warming between the Russians and the Germans to the point that the Russians can say to the rest of Europe, particularly that under the Anglo banking establishment, no gas, but Germany can have some. All right. And Germany can say to the rest of Europe, you owe money and we're going to institute a new currency and this is how it's going to be. They can literally, if they get control collateral wise of this debt, they could actually say, and it would be in their interests to say, forget about the debt. We'll now issue the money backed by the currency, by the gold under our control. All right. This is what would seem to be the end game that is being played over generations, initiated by the likes of Bormann. And the fact that you've got that character Putin, running the show in Russia. Now, you know, whatever anybody thinks about Putin, he's a nationalist. Number one, he's Russian first and foremost, and it seems he's very much at odds with what you would call the Anglo banking sphere of influence.
No doubt.
No doubt about it. He's an icy cold character. He's a chess master. He's a judo. He's a real deal. He's a fighter pilot. He's uh, an extremely cool customer to be dealing with. And if anybody is going to stare down the Anglo banking establishment when they come in and say, "We'll just get America to nuke you if you don't play ball," he's the man that has that capacity. So and it's been drifting that way ever since he gave that dirty glare to George Bush at the Beijing Olympics. We know where it's going between the United States and Russia. What I would say on the Russians' behalf is that they went through so much crap thanks to the likes of Hank Paulson and his Goldman Sachs gang during the collapse at that time that the Russian leadership, I believe, understand that they're not dealing with the American people here.
Yes.
All right, they're dealing with the with those elements that have captured the American people, the fascist elite, political banking, whatever level, particularly the banking level. They know what the story is. So essentially, being the great chess masters that they are, and being the Germans the great engineers that they are, they've played a long-term game that says money isn't the all of it. If we've got the productive capacity backed up by the resources, all right, then we can institute a alternative economic system to the one that is dominated by the American currency at this time. And of course, the uh, the front line of this conflict is Iran at this particular time, and this is Syria and all this sort of stuff is really just sort of drawing us um, ever closer to the banker's age-old last card to play, which is to, if all else fails, start a war.
This is the end of part one. Please proceed to part two.